Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everybody who supports my work, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life and helping you to achieve your goals, or a listener or supporter of the podcast. Thank you to all of you for allowing me to live my vision every day. Today I'm going to be talking about the concept of the inner child, something that is often discussed, especially with trends on social media relating to mental health, but I don't believe that people adequately explain exactly what this concept means. Now, as per usual, this is not advice of any kind. If you have concerns at all about any aspect of your life, please seek help from a professional. But this is a primer on what these ideas mean to stimulate discussion. Now, with the proliferation of content on the internet and in culture about mental health, which is ultimately good because it raises awareness of issues that are incredibly important, people often cite that problems that we experience in our adult lives are a result of our inner child, or relating to our inner child with unmet needs. And this is often used in reference to issues such as people-pleasing, in which we're hesitant to cater to our own interests, even if it's reasonable to do so, for fear of upsetting somebody else, or how we treat our children if we're parents or if we've experienced trauma. The origin of this concept actually has merit, and it does quite effectively explain how trauma and the means by which we were raised affect us in our adult lives. So I'm not discounting the concept in and of itself. However, like many concepts of mental health, a lot of these topics only become trends because they're attractive. They seem to appeal to people's desire for an explanation. The problem is that in culture and on social media, many people only spread these types of ideas as a means of garnering support. The problem is that, like with many ideas that are spread on social media and in culture, people tend to oversimplify them to the extent that they don't adequately explain what the concept means and how to properly use it. They tend to spread what's likely to be attractive to people, what's likely to garner attention, rather than what's likely to challenge people's current understanding and increase their awareness of important issues. And this is something I actively avoid in my work, including on my podcast. If you're going to oversimplify a topic to the extent that it loses the richness of its meaning and you miss an opportunity to properly enrich their knowledge, rather than simply giving them an easy concept that settles their desire for a simple explanation about what happens in the world, then you're not doing them any favours. You're actually just turning important issues into matters that are no more significant than fashion trends. And this is not a healthy way to be dealing with important issues. So today I'm going to be explaining what the inner child actually means and how it applies to people. Now, the concept of the inner child is largely explained by schema theory. Schemas are specific sets of ideas that govern how we interpret the information that we learn in the world and how we ultimately use that to deal with the world around us. Now, in our early life, learning to cope with the world, to understand the world, to decide what to think about the world, and to ultimately decide what to do in the world, however much we take it for granted as common sense, is actually a set of skills that we have to develop. And even matters that seem as simple as how we perceive ourselves, whether we perceive ourselves as good or bad or competent or incompetent or deserving of certain things or undeserving of certain things, how we perceive others, whether we perceive the world generally as made up of good or bad people, whether we perceive others as generally trustworthy or not trustworthy, whether we perceive negative events as being a result of bad luck or whether they're a result of bad intentions by other people, whether certain acts are morally acceptable or unacceptable according to our values, what we have a duty to do and what is not reasonably our duty, and similar. A lot of these ideas, though they may seem to be innate to us, actually are developed by what we learn in our early life. And we don't simply learn it by being explicitly taught those ideas, we actually learn it by observation. So it's possible that many of the ideas that we hold true about the world are taught to us by our parents or our teachers or other important figures of our life. Often people do explicitly tell us what is right and what is wrong, or what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe, and what we should do and what we shouldn't do. But often, the young mind, even though it can't communicate or necessarily be aware of everything that it's observing, often does make subconscious interpretations of what it observes. And so a child, when they see other people behaving in certain ways, can actually learn how to behave and what to think about the world. And often, because that is such a critical period for development, the lessons that we learn in those periods, if they are left unchallenged, can affect how we live our life in a later period. So for example, if we see our parents behaving in a certain way, then we may assume, because our parents are authority figures and by nature we're meant to trust them, that those behaviours are acceptable, because the logic of a child would be, if something wasn't acceptable, then why would my parents, who are by definition authoritative figures and who are meant to know the difference between right and wrong, be doing them? Or alternatively, if we see our parents doing something and we may see the outcome as particularly undesirable to us, then it may teach us, theoretically, that just because somebody claims to be an authority figure, that it doesn't mean what they do is always right. And we may actually develop through that a critical thinking ability. It may not happen as often, but it is still theoretically possible to happen. And even though someone didn't approach us specifically and say, you see what your parents are doing, it's right or wrong, our minds can still make interpretations of that. We can also learn lessons from more subtle actions as well. So for example, if a child is constantly approaching one of their parents when they're at a social gathering and that parent is sitting with another adult and having a conversation with them, and the child needs something from their parent and the parent is ignoring them because they want to speak to their friend, what that child may subtly be learning from that is whatever your needs are less important than your parents' friends' needs. Now, how you deal with that to avoid those harmful schemas developing is a different story, but this is an example of how the mind can make interpretations of very subtle phenomena. Now, a good example of the full workings of the inner child manifests in the study and the treatment of trauma. What's important to understand is that trauma is not necessarily one simple horrific event that involves violence or massive destruction or an assault or a raping, and it doesn't have to mean constant physical punishment. Trauma can develop from emotional abuse as well, and even emotional neglect, in which people don't necessarily deliberately act in malice, but simply don't know how to properly nurture your emotional maturity when you're young. That can result in symptoms that ultimately become trauma. Now, people like to deny this because they like to think that advocating for understanding and compassion towards the mentally ill is just some political conspiracy to turn society soft. Now, I've made it clear in the past that this is complete nonsense, and I've given explanations as to why that is. I'm going to continue to discuss that. I'm not going to explore it too deeply here because this is not the topic of the episode, but I can very much tell you as a trauma survivor myself that emotional trauma is real. Using that more subtle form of emotional neglect as the example here. When a child is brought into the world, they do have some innate assumptions. Okay? Part of natural order is that parents are meant to take care of the child, nurture them, teach them how to properly survive and live their lives, tend to their needs, and the child is ultimately meant to feel safe and noticed and protected in their parents' presence. That is natural order. That is what the child is meant to feel. If parents don't properly attend to their child's emotional needs, then that child is potentially going to develop problems. So if a child, for example, were to have a minor accident in which they experience maybe a cut or a bruise, it's not a major injury, it's not going to be deadly, it's not going to disable them in any way, but the child might have a rather severe reaction to that because of the pain that was caused. Now, to an adult, it may not seem so significant, but to a child who's only just willing to deal with the world and hasn't yet developed the physical strength to cope with those types of events, they might be rather distraught. If a parent dismisses the child's distress and says, "Oh, stop crying, it's not that big a deal," to the child in that moment, because they haven't properly learned to deal with the world yet and they haven't developed the ability to cope with that sort of adversity, what they're essentially being taught is, if you feel suffering from adversity, it doesn't matter. Your feelings don't matter. If a child is having trouble making friends at school but they're not in any immediate physical danger and they're being well looked after and well educated, and the child is in distress because of that and they come to their parents looking for guidance and the parents dismiss it stating, "It's no big deal, you go to a good school, don't worry, you'll make friends someday." What the child is learning from that is, in the world, you can't trust people to help you during difficulties because your adversity doesn't matter. A more specific example might be in the case of an autistic child, and an autistic child may be more sensitive to certain events in the environment, like changes in routine or specific sensory experiences, and those experiences can be distressing to them if they reach a certain threshold. So what may seem insignificant to anybody else may be quite significant and quite disruptive to an autistic child, and it may interfere with their ability to actually function and enjoy the world. So if, for example, a child has sensory issues when eating and they can't have certain foods because the sensory experience of the textures or the flavors of those foods is too strong for them and they can't actually eat them without feeling unwell, or they can't wear certain clothes because the physical sensation of wearing them is too intense for them and they can't feel comfortable, or a change in routine, while it may seem insignificant to others, triggers anxiety because they're not sure what to expect from it, and their concerns are not addressed, and they don't get reassurance and assistance from those that are meant to be caring for them, and instead they're simply dismissed and told, deal with it, that's the world. Not only are you teaching that child your feelings don't matter, but what you're also potentially doing is teaching that child that in order to survive in the world, they have to force themselves to do things that are actually potentially disabling to them. And that leads to what we call masking, in which an autistic person tries to act normal, so to speak, in order to integrate into the environment around them. But the act of doing that is so disruptive to their executive functioning that it actually causes other problems in living for them. As I've often stated in the past, the human mind favours quick, simple explanations of what is happening in the world around them, because our survival depends on us being able to make quick explanations and seek quick solutions to problems and to negotiate the world around us in a quick fashion. If we spent too much time analysing everything, we wouldn't be able to survive because we'd never get anything done. And a child tries to make sense of the world in this way, and they use, as I've said in the past, what we call heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that try to find the most logical answer to a question. There are a number of innate tendencies that humans have in order to try to function optimally, and sometimes these can become maladaptive. One of them is that we have an innate tendency to try and avoid anxiety of the world around us. If we were constantly focusing, as some people are who experience anxiety, on all the deficits in the world around us, like the fact that there are many people who don't care, the fact that there are dangers around us, the fact that that the world can be an unsafe place and that sometimes people can't be trusted and that sometimes people do have bad intentions. If we were constantly focused on that, we would have so much anxiety that we just would not be able to function. So what our mind often does, it's been theorised, is try to find an explanation that is less anxiety-inducing. And one of the other heuristics that is manifest in this activity is what's called the just world hypothesis, or the just world fallacy, which assumes that the world is a fair place in which we get what we deserve and deserve what we get. And so if something bad happens to a person, it must be because they're a bad person, or if something good happens to a person, it must be because they're a good person. That is an oversimplified explanation of the world that is our mind's attempt at an unconscious level to maintain our sense of safety in the world, the sense that yes, everything is fair, everything happens for a justifiable reason. And so if a child is constantly facing that type of adversity, it would be so anxiety-inducing for them to accept at that age that the world is an inherently dangerous place in which bad things often happen to people who don't deserve them, that their mind makes an oversimplified interpretation that is less anxiety-inducing. That is to say, this was all my fault, it's my duty to adapt. And that overly simplistic explanation helps to avoid anxiety by maintaining the individual's sense of order in the world, as if to say, don't worry, the world is still orderly. We can very easily explain why bad things and good things happen to people. It's always because it's always because they're deserved. In a strange way, our mind likes to keep order that way. Now, when a person develops that as a habit, just like any behavioural habit, like accidentally opening the wrong cupboard in the kitchen to get a mug after a long time of keeping the mugs there, only to remember that you moved the mugs to a different cupboard a few days ago. Changing mental habits like this is extremely difficult, and more so when they're not addressed closer to the time at which they're actually developed. Often what happens is, when a child develops these ideas about the world, they engage in selection bias in which their mind is more attuned to the information from their environment and is more likely to collect information in the environment that confirms that those ideas that they developed about the world were true, and ignores information that suggests that they're false. And so as they grow through childhood, their adolescence, and then into adulthood, they will constantly be referring to those ideas, called schemas, to decide how to act in certain situations. And as some examples, a child who has experienced these events may develop to be a people pleaser. A child in this situation has learned it's always my duty to satisfy other people's needs, but I should never ask other people to satisfy mine, or expect other people to satisfy mine, or make reasonable accommodations for myself to avoid myself being exploited, because it is always my fault if someone isn't satisfied, and therefore I must always do what makes other people happy. Or if they develop a schema that the world is an inherently untrustworthy place, they may develop emotional reactivity in which they always interpret other people's actions as being malicious, and they may become emotionally reactive in response to subtle signals from other people that they're being malicious, when in reality those people weren't being malicious at all. And in fact, it was just that person's interpretation of the actions that suggested that they were malicious. And this is characteristic of trauma-related illnesses such as post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder, and some possible other disorders, including personality disorders, that may develop as a result of trauma. So the outcome is that that person's inner child is not a literal part of themselves that has not yet matured, or that is still trying to be immature. The inner child represents the metaphysical result of them not properly learning to respond to the world in an emotionally healthy way. And when I say emotionally healthy, I don't just mean with regards to other people's interests, but also with regard to their own needs and their own safety. The inner child is essentially that gap in their knowledge of how to emotionally respond to the world. Now, to be able to properly address this problem, what we need is to be able to educate people on what this inner child actually is. Educating them from the start about how the inner child develops, about all the dynamics of it in a way that's appropriate, and then fully explain to them how to heal that inner child in a healthy manner. Often it's not possible to completely change when you've had those traumatic experiences, but it is usually possible to make at least some change, and that is a start at least. But vague statements like you see on social media, such as "be kind to yourself, you're worth it, you deserve it," are just too vague to actually command action. What does being kind to yourself look like? Right? What do you deserve? Do you deserve everything? This is why I don't like social media education, because there's no point overly simplifying or dumbing down concepts to the point that they don't command action. Okay, we're not trying to attract people so that we become popular. We're not trying to make things popular. We're trying to educate people on a deeper level so that they fully understand what do I have to do in order to change this aspect of my life which I don't like, or which is causing harm to me. This is often left out in cultural discussions because a lot of people don't seem to want to engage that deeply. They want simple explanations. But what's in people's best interests is not simple explanations, but challenging current understandings. And as a counsellor, I have to do that with my clients. If a client says they're always responsible for everything that happens to them, then sometimes I can see that that's not always the case, and I have to challenge them and say, let's examine the evidence for it, but also let's examine the evidence against it, and then let's examine which evidence holds more weight, because often it's the evidence against that idea when people are constantly blaming themselves for everything. But ultimately, education rather than simple trends are what are going to lead to change. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, what you see on the internet is not advice. If you have any concerns at all, please contact a professional to seek advice. And I'd love to hear from my audience, whether you're wanting to collaborate with me, whether you'd like to be a guest on the show, whether you have an idea about what you'd like to hear discussed, please feel free to contact me. And until next time, take care.